The handcuffs clicked shut, echoing louder than the thunder rolling over the Oakwood cemetery. Sergeant Rick Studer smirked, shoving the grieving mother against the side of his cruiser, convinced he had just caught a high-end fraudster. He didn't care that her son was being lowered into the ground 10 feet away. He didn't care about the silent, terrified tears streaming down her face. He saw a black woman in a Jaguar she couldn't possibly afford, and decided to ruin her life. But Rick didn't know who he was arresting. He didn't know that the woman in the handcuffs wasn't just a mother. She was Justice Vivian Banks, the newest appointee to the Supreme Court. And that mistake? It was about to cost the city $18 million. The rain in Seattle didn't wash things clean. It just made everything heavier. On this particular Tuesday, the sky over Oakwood Memorial Park was a bruised purple, swelling with a storm that refused to break. The air was thick, smelling of wet pine needles, upturned earth, and the suffocating scent of white lilies. Under a canopy of black umbrellas, a congregation of 50 people stood in absolute silence, their breath misting in the cold air. At the center of the semicircle stood Vivian Banks. She was 52 years old, though today she looked 100. Her posture, usually rigid and imposing, a byproduct of 3 decades navigating the country's most vicious courtrooms, was slumped. She wore a black Givenchy coat that was soaked through at the shoulders, her hands clutching a damp tissue that had long since disintegrated. She wasn't Justice Banks today. She wasn't the iron gavel of the Ninth Circuit. She was just a mother staring at a mahogany box that held the only thing she had ever truly loved: her 24-year-old son, Darius. "Ashes to ashes," the priest intoned, his voice fighting against the wind. "Dust to dust." Vivian didn't hear him. Her mind was replaying the phone call from 2 weeks ago. The aneurysm had been sudden, no warning signs. Darius, a brilliant architectural student, had just collapsed. 1 minute he was sketching a skyline, the next he was gone. Standing next to Vivian was her husband, Charles, a retired neurosurgeon, whose stoicism was cracking. He held an umbrella over Vivian, though he was shaking so badly the rain still hit her face. Behind them, the guests were a mixture of family friends and Washington's elite, senators, federal judges, and clerks, though, out of respect for Vivian's privacy, there was no press. No security detail was visible at her specific request. She wanted this to be about Darius, not her recent, history-making appointment to the Supreme Court. She wanted to be normal, just for today. But normal was a luxury Vivian had rarely been afforded. As the priest sprinkled the first handful of dirt onto the casket, a sound tore through the solemn atmosphere. It wasn't thunder. It was the aggressive, mechanical chirp of a siren, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. Heads turned. The cemetery was private, gated. No one was supposed to be here. A Dodge Charger police cruiser, emblazoned with the precinct number 412, swerved around the hearse, kicking up mud onto the pristinely manicured grass. The vehicle came to a halt less than 20 feet from the open grave, its blue and red lights flashing rhythmically, painting the mourners' faces in chaotic bursts of color. Vivian blinked, pulling herself out of her grief-stricken daze. She felt Charles stiffen beside her. "Ignore it," Charles whispered, his voice trembling with anger. "Just ignore it." But the car door opened. A heavy boot slammed into a puddle. Out stepped Sergeant Rick Studer. He was a man who wore his badge like a shield and his gun like a threat. He was broad-shouldered, with a buzz cut that did little to hide the redness of his neck, and eyes that scanned the crowd with practiced suspicion. He adjusted his belt, hitched up his pants, and began to walk directly toward the grave, stepping over a bouquet of roses as if it were trash. The priest stopped speaking. The silence that followed was louder than the siren. Rick Studer had been having a bad week. His captain was riding him about quotas, his ex-wife was demanding more alimony, and the coffee at the precinct had been burnt. He was looking for a win. He was looking for someone to take it out on. When he had patrolled past the cemetery, he'd seen the cars. A fleet of black Mercedes, a Bentley, and right at the front, a vintage Jaguar E-Type. It was the Jaguar that caught his eye. He'd run the plates. They came back to a Vivian Banks. He didn't recognize the name. He didn't bother to check the employment history or the federal flags on the file. All Rick saw was a suspended registration notification from 2 days ago, a clerical error, a glitch in the DMV system that hadn't updated after a recent insurance renewal. But to Rick Studer, a suspended registration on a $100,000 car in a neighborhood like this meant one thing: drug money or theft. He marched up the grassy knoll, his hand resting casually, dangerously, near his holster. "Who's the owner of the Jag?" Rick barked, his voice booming over the sound of the rain. The mourners parted. These were powerful people, used to wielding authority, not submitting to it. Senator Higgins, a tall man with silver hair, stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "Officer," Higgins said, his voice low and dangerous, "this is a funeral. Have some respect and turn off those lights." Rick sneered. He hated men like this, men in three-piece suits who thought they owned the world. "I didn't ask for a commentary, Grandpa. I asked who owns the Jaguar out front. Plates are flagged, suspended registration, and from the looks of this..." He gestured vaguely at the crowd, his eyes landing on Vivian. "We might have some stolen property issues, too." Vivian stepped away from Charles. She felt a coldness settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the rain. She wiped her face, composing herself with the terrifying calm that had made seasoned prosecutors stutter in her courtroom. "I own the vehicle," Vivian said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "I am Vivian Banks, and you are interrupting my son's burial." Rick looked her up and down. He saw a black woman in expensive clothes. He saw the diamonds in her ears. He saw the defiance in her eyes. His bias filled in the rest of the narrative. Uppity, criminal, fake. "Vivian Banks," Rick repeated, mocking the enunciation. "Well, Vivian, your registration is suspended. And frankly, I'm not buying that you own a classic Jag. We've had a lot of high-end auto thefts in the area recently. Why don't you step away from the hole and come show me some ID?" A collective gasp went through the crowd. "Officer!" Charles stepped in, his hands balled into fists. "My wife is burying our son. If there is a ticket to write, write it. But do not speak to her like that." Rick stepped into Charles's space, nose to nose. "Sir, back up, or I'll cite you for obstruction. I'm conducting an investigation." He looked back at Vivian. "Now, ID. Or cuffs. Your choice." Vivian stared at him. She studied his nameplate. Studer. She memorized his face, the scar on his chin, the arrogance in his posture. She knew the law better than he ever would. She knew that a suspended registration was a non-arrestable traffic infraction in this state. She knew he had no probable cause to suspect auto theft. She knew he was violating her Fourth Amendment rights. But she also knew that if she resisted, if she raised her voice, he would escalate. She looked at the open grave, at the brass handles of Darius's coffin. She couldn't let this turn into a brawl. She couldn't let Darius's last moment above ground be marked by violence. "Charles," she said softly, "it's okay." "It is not okay, Viv," Charles shouted, tears finally spilling over. "It's okay," she repeated. She looked Rick in the eye. "I will show you my identification." But I suggest, Officer Studer, that you think very carefully about your next move, because you are making a mistake that you cannot undo." Rick laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound. "I'll take my chances. Let's go." He reached out and grabbed her wrist. He didn't wait for her to walk. He yanked her. The motion was violent enough that Vivian stumbled in her heels. A murmur of outrage erupted from the guests. Senator Higgins reached for his phone, presumably to call the police chief, but Rick spun around, unclipping his taser. "Everyone stay back," Rick shouted, adrenaline flooding his system. "Back up, or you're all going in." He twisted Vivian's arm behind her back, forcing her toward the cruiser. "You want to threaten me? You want to talk about mistakes? The mistake was thinking you could parade around my town in a stolen car." Vivian didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She allowed him to push her face against the cold, wet metal of the police car. She felt the cold steel of the handcuffs bite into her wrists, pinching the delicate skin. "You have the right to remain silent," Rick recited, patting her down roughly, his hands lingering too long on the pockets of her coat. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." Vivian closed her eyes. Rainwater dripped from her nose, mixing with the mud on the hood of the car. "I am a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States," she thought, "and I am being arrested at my child's funeral." "Officer," Vivian said, her voice muffled against the car. "Check my purse. The identification is in the front pocket. It's a federal ID." Rick scoffed, opening the back door and shoving her inside. The hard plastic seat smelled of stale vomit and sanitizer. Yeah, federal ID. I'm sure you're the Queen of England, too. Sit tight, sweetheart. We're going to the station." He slammed the door. Inside the car, the silence was absolute. Vivian watched through the wire mesh as Rick walked back to the driver's seat. She saw Charles running toward the car, screaming, held back by two other mourners. She saw the senator on his phone, his face pale. Rick got in, revving the engine. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "You people never learn," he muttered. He threw the car into reverse, spinning tires on the wet grass, leaving deep, ugly ruts in the cemetery lawn as he sped away, leaving a grieving father and an open grave behind in the rain. The ride to the 412th precinct was a blur of rain-streaked windows and the crackle of the police radio. Vivian sat in the back, her wrists aching, her wet coat chilling her to the bone. She didn't speak. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She knew that any word she uttered now would just be fuel for Sergeant Studer's ego. She needed him to dig his grave so deep that he could never climb out. When they arrived at the station, Rick pulled her out of the car with the same unnecessary roughness. He paraded her through the back entrance, past the break room where other officers were eating donuts and drinking coffee. "Got a live one," Rick announced, shoving Vivian toward the booking desk. "Grand theft auto, resisting, and possession of a forged federal document." The booking officer, a tired-looking woman named Sergeant Miller, looked up from her computer. She popped a bubble of gum and eyed Vivian's soaking wet couture coat. "Fancy car?" Miller asked. "Jaguar," Rick said, unlocking Vivian's cuffs but keeping a grip on her arm. "Claims it's hers. Claims she's somebody." Vivian rubbed her wrists. Red welts were already forming. She looked at Sergeant Miller. "I need to make a phone call. Immediately." "You'll get your call after processing," Rick snapped. "Empty your pockets. Purse on the counter. Jewelry off." Vivian hesitated, her hand going to her necklace, a simple gold chain with a small locket containing Darius's baby picture. "Everything," Rick barked. Slowly, with trembling fingers, Vivian unclasped the necklace. She placed it on the cold metal counter. Then came the diamond studs. Then her watch. Finally, she reached into her coat and pulled out her slim leather wallet. Rick snatched the wallet. He flipped it open, looking for cash to count. Instead, his thumb brushed over a heavy metallic card in the ID slot. He pulled it out. It was a federal identification card, embossed with the gold seal of the United States. Below the photo of Vivian, it read, "Justice Vivian Banks, Supreme Court of the United States." Rick stared at it for a second. Then he snorted. "Look at this," he said, tossing the card to Miller. "High quality. Where'd you get this printed? Downtown? Or did you order it from one of those sovereign citizen websites?" Miller picked it up, squinting. "Looks pretty real, Rick." "It's fake," Rick insisted, his voice loud. "She's a fraud. Look at her. Does she look like a Supreme Court justice to you? She was at a funeral for some kid, probably a gang-related shooting. It's all part of the cover." Vivian felt a spike of rage so hot it almost blinded her. "My son," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "died of a brain aneurysm. He was an honor student, and you have just desecrated his memory." Rick leaned over the counter, his face inches from hers. "Save the sob story for the public defender. Prince. Now." The next 20 minutes were a nightmare of bureaucratic humiliation. Vivian's hands, which had signed landmark rulings and written dissenting opinions that shaped national policy, were pressed into black ink. She was shoved against a height chart. Turn left, turn right. Chin up. The flash of the camera blinded her. "Name?" Rick asked, typing into the computer. "Vivian Banks," she said. "Occupation?" "Associate Justice of the Supreme Court." Rick rolled his eyes and typed, "Unemployed, refused to state." "All right, Your Highness," Rick said, grabbing her arm again. "The VIP suite is full, so you're going in with the general population." He marched her down a hallway that smelled of urine and industrial bleach. He stopped at a cell barred with heavy steel. Inside, 3 women sat on benches. One was asleep. The other 2 were arguing over a cigarette. Rick unlocked the door and shoved Vivian inside. She stumbled, catching herself against the wall. "Enjoy the accommodations," Rick said, slamming the gate shut. The lock clicked, a sound of finality. "Maybe while you're in there, you can come up with a better lie." He turned and walked away, whistling. Vivian stood in the center of the cell. The women stopped talking and looked at her. They looked at her expensive, ruined clothes. They looked at the way she held herself. "What you in for, Mama?" one of the women asked, a young girl with dyed red hair and a bruised eye. Vivian smoothed her coat. She walked over to the cleanest spot on the metal bench and sat down, her back ramrod straight. "I am in," Vivian said calmly, "for teaching a lesson." 45 minutes later, the atmosphere in the 412th precinct shifted. It started with a phone call. The desk sergeant answered it, frowned, and looked at the phone as if it had bitten him. Then another line rang. Then 3 more. Then the fax machine started screaming. In his office, Captain Greg O'Malley was trying to finish a budget report when his private line rang. Only the mayor and the police chief had that number. He picked it up. "O'Malley," he grunted. "Greg." It was the chief of police. His voice wasn't angry, it was terrified. "Greg, tell me you didn't do it." "Do what?" O'Malley asked, sitting up. "Tell me your precinct didn't just arrest a sitting U.S. Supreme Court justice in the middle of a funeral." O'Malley blinked. "What?" "Chief, have you been drinking?" "We arrested a car thief. Rick Studer brought her in. Some lady with a fake ID claiming to be—" "Wait." O'Malley felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Greg," the chief whispered, "I have the governor on the other line. I have Senator Higgins screaming at me that he's going to burn the city down. He says Sergeant Studer dragged Justice Vivian Banks away from her son's grave. Please, Greg, please tell me she isn't in a cell." O'Malley dropped the phone. He ran out of his office. The main floor was in chaos. Every phone was ringing. Officers were looking at each other in confusion. "Studer!" O'Malley roared. His voice cracked like a whip. Rick Studer was at the coffee machine, laughing with another officer about the Queen of England he'd just booked. He turned around, smiling. "Yeah, Cap?" O'Malley sprinted across the room. He didn't stop until he was inches from Rick's face. "The woman, the Jaguar. Where is she?" Rick looked confused. "The fraudster? She's in holding cell 2. Why? Did her pimp show up to bail her out?" "You idiot!" O'Malley screamed, spraying spit in Rick's face. "You absolute moronic idiot!" He grabbed Rick by the collar of his uniform and dragged him toward the booking desk. "Miller, give me the ID. The one Studer said was fake." Sergeant Miller, looking pale, fumbled with the evidence bag. She handed it to the captain. O'Malley held it up. He pulled out his own phone and frantically Googled Vivian Banks Supreme Court. He shoved the phone screen into Rick's face. On the screen was an official portrait of Vivian Banks in her black judicial robes, standing next to the President of the United States. Rick looked at the phone. He looked at the ID in the bag. He looked at the phone again. The smugness didn't just leave Rick's face, it shattered. His skin turned a sickly shade of grey. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "That's..." Rick stammered. The registration was suspended, Cap. The system said..." "I don't care what the system said," O'Malley bellowed. "You arrested a Supreme Court justice at a funeral. Do you have any idea what you've done? You didn't just end your career, Studer. You just bankrupt the department." The front doors of the precinct burst open. It wasn't a lawyer. It was a phalanx of men in dark suits with earpieces. The U.S. Marshals. Behind them, Senator Higgins and Charles Banks stormed in. Charles looked ready to kill. "Where is my wife?" Charles shouted. O'Malley turned to Rick. "Get the keys now!" Rick's hands were shaking so badly he dropped the keys twice. I didn't know. She didn't look like... "Shut up," O'Malley hissed. "Not another word. You are going to go back there. You are going to open that cell. And you are going to pray to whatever God you believe in that she doesn't decide to destroy us all." Rick walked down the hallway like a man walking to the gallows. The smell of bleach seemed stronger now, suffocating. He reached the cell. Inside, Vivian was sitting exactly where he had left her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She was staring at the wall with a terrifying, serene focus. Rick put the key in the lock. The click sounded like a gunshot. "Ma'am?" Rick squeaked. His voice was an octave higher than usual. "Ma'am, there's been a mistake." Vivian turned her head slowly. Her eyes locked onto his. "A mistake implies an accident, Sergeant," she said. Her voice was ice. This was a choice. She stood up. The other women in the cell pulled back, sensing the power radiating from her. Vivian walked to the open door, but she didn't step out. She stood on the threshold, looking down at Rick. "You took my dignity," she said. "You took my last moments with my son. You thought you were exercising power over the powerless." She stepped out, forcing Rick to scramble backward. "You have no idea," she whispered, "what power really looks like. But you are about to learn." The days following the arrest were a whirlwind that threatened to consume the entire city of Seattle. Vivian didn't go home to rest. After leaving the precinct, she went straight back to the cemetery. In the dark, under the beam of a security light, she finally said goodbye to her son. She knelt in the mud, her ruined coat wrapped around her, and made a promise to the fresh earth. "I will burn it down, Darius. I will burn the rot out of this city for you." By the next morning, the story hadn't just broken, it had exploded. a mourner had filmed the arrest. The video, titled "Cop Arrests Supreme Court Justice at Funeral," had 20 million views in 8 hours. It showed everything: the open grave, the grieving mother, the sneer on Rick Studer's face, and the violent yank of the handcuffs. The fallout was nuclear. Mayor Beatrice Kroll called a press conference at 8 a.m. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week. "We are launching a full internal investigation," she told the sea of microphones. "Officer Studer has been placed on administrative leave, pending." But Vivian wasn't interested in administrative leave. At 9 a.m., Vivian's legal team filed a lawsuit in the Federal District Court for the Western District of Washington. It wasn't just a complaint, it was a war declaration. Banks v. the City of Seattle and Richard Studer. The suit alleged false arrest, excessive force, malicious prosecution, and violation of civil rights under Section 1983. The damages sought? $18 million. It was an astronomical sum intended to make a statement. But the money wasn't the point. Vivian made that clear in her own press conference on the steps of the courthouse. She stood at the podium, Charles by her side. She wore a crisp navy suit, her face composed, but her eyes burning with a cold, terrifying intelligence. "Yesterday," Vivian began, her voice echoing off the stone pillars, "I was stripped of my rights. I was stripped of my dignity. And most unforgivably, I was stripped of the right to bury my child in peace." She paused, looking directly into the camera lenses. Sergeant Studer saw a black woman in a luxury car and decided she was a criminal. He ignored the context. He ignored the law. He acted on bias and ego. The city of Seattle has allowed officers like him to operate with impunity for too long. They think a badge is a license to bully. Today, I am here to tell them the bill has come due. Inside the precinct, the mood was funereal. Rick Studer sat in the union representative's office, his arms crossed. He was still trying to play the victim. "I followed protocol," Rick insisted to his union lawyer, a weary man named Saul Goodman. No relation, just an unfortunate coincidence. The plates were flagged. She resisted. How was I supposed to know who she was? "Rick," Saul sighed, rubbing his temples. "She's on the Supreme Court. You don't oops your way out of arresting a Supreme Court justice. The mayor wants your head on a spike. The police chief wants to fire you yesterday. And they are offering a settlement, but she won't take it unless the case goes to public trial." "Let it go to trial," Rick sneered. "A jury will see it my way. I'm a cop doing his job in a high-crime era. They'll respect that." Rick was delusional. He was banking on the blue wall of silence to protect him. But he didn't realize that the wall was already crumbling. The other officers in the precinct, the ones who did their jobs right, the ones who were now getting spat on in the street because of Rick's viral video. They weren't standing with him. They were turning their backs. The city attorney tried to settle. They offered $5 million, then 10. Vivian rejected every offer. "I want him on the stand," she told her lead counsel, a shark of a litigator named Robert Shapiro. "I want him to say what he did under oath. I want the world to see him." 6 months later, the courtroom was packed. It was the hottest ticket in the country. Rick Studer sat at the defense table, wearing a suit that didn't fit quite right. He looked uncomfortable, his neck red. He still had a glint of defiance in his eyes, though. He was convinced he could charm the jury. 7 women, 5 men. Vivian sat at the plaintiff's table. She was silent, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. She wasn't the lawyer today, she was the victim. But everyone in the room knew who was really in charge. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The city's defense was weak. They tried to argue qualified immunity, the legal doctrine that shields cops from lawsuits unless they violate clearly established rights. But Robert Shapiro, Vivian's lawyer, dismantled that argument in his opening statement. "There is no right more clearly established," Shapiro boomed, "than the right to be free from unreasonable seizure without probable cause. And there is no act more unreasonable than arresting a grieving mother at a funeral based on a hunch." The climax came when Rick took the stand. He walked up with a swagger, swearing to tell the truth. Under direct examination by the city's lawyer, he stuck to his script. "I felt threatened," Rick said, looking at the jury. "There was a crowd. The suspect, Justice Banks, was agitated. I had to secure the scene." Then it was Shapiro's turn for cross-examination. Shapiro stood up slowly. He didn't yell. He walked over to the podium and placed a small thumb drive on it. "Mr. Studer," Shapiro said pleasantly, "you testified that you arrested Mrs. Banks because of a suspended registration and because you feared for your safety. Is that correct?" "Yes," Rick said. "And you testified that your body camera was malfunctioning during the first 5 minutes of the encounter? That's why there is no audio of your initial approach." Rick shifted in his seat. "That's right. Equipment glitch. Happens all the time." "Interesting," Shapiro said. "Because we had your body camera analyzed by a forensic audio specialist. It turns out the camera wasn't malfunctioning. It was just covered by your heavy rain jacket collar. The lens was blocked, yes. But the microphone? The microphone was working perfectly." The color drained from Rick's face. "Would you like to hear what you said to yourself as you walked up that hill, Mr. Studer?" "Objection!" the city attorney screamed. "This was not disclosed." "It was submitted into evidence this morning, Your Honor," Shapiro countered. "Impeachment evidence." The judge, a stern woman named Judge Thorne, nodded. "Play it." Shapiro pressed a button. A hush fell over the courtroom. The speakers crackled with the sound of rain and heavy breathing. Then, Rick's voice, clear as day. "Look at these rich pricks. Think they can park on the grass. Oh, look at that Jag. Bet you $20 the driver is some affirmative action hire, spending daddy's money. I'm gonna ruin her day. Watch this." The recording continued. "Suspended reg? Perfect. I don't care if it's a glitch. I'm taking the car. Teach them some respect." The audio cut off. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was suffocating. Rick Studer looked like he was going to vomit. He looked at the jury. They weren't looking at him with respect anymore. They were looking at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. One juror, an older woman, was openly glaring at him. Shapiro let the silence stretch for a full minute. "You weren't afraid, were you, Mr. Studer?" Shapiro asked quietly. "Aye," Rick croaked. "You weren't investigating a crime. You saw a successful black woman, and you wanted to ruin her day. You wanted to teach her respect. Is that correct?" Rick looked at his lawyer. His lawyer was staring at the table, refusing to make eye contact. Rick stammered. "It was just locker room talk. I didn't mean—" "You arrested a mother at her son's funeral for locker room talk," Shapiro roared, slamming his hand on the railing. The sound made everyone jump. "You put her in a cage because you were jealous, because you are a small, hateful man with a badge." "I did my job!" Rick screamed, losing control. "She shouldn't have been there. She acted like she was better than me." "She is better than you," Shapiro said coldly. "No further questions." Rick was excused. He stumbled off the stand, a broken man. He knew it was over. The city attorney knew it was over. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood up. "In the matter of Banks v. City of Seattle, we find for the plaintiff, Vivian Banks. On the count of false arrest, liable. On the count of malicious prosecution, liable. On the count of civil rights violations, liable. We award the plaintiff compensatory damages in the amount of $3 million, the foreman read. Rick let out a breath. $3 million. The city would pay that. He might still lose his job, but... And, the foreman continued, we award punitive damages against the city and Richard Studer personally in the amount of $15 million. Total, $18 million. The gavel banged. Rick stared at the table. $15 million in punitive damages. The city's insurance would cover some, but the personal part, the jury had sent a message. He would be destitute. He would lose his pension. He would lose his house. But the karma wasn't done yet. As the courtroom began to clear, 2 U.S. Marshals walked through the back door. They weren't there for security. They walked straight to the defense table. One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Richard Studer, the marshal said, you are under arrest for federal civil rights deprivation, under color of law, and perjury. Rick looked up, panic seizing his chest. What? No! The trial is over. It's civil. The civil trial is over, Vivian said. She had walked over to the table. She stood over him, tall, regal, and terrifying. Now the criminal trial begins. You lied under oath about the body camera, Rick. That's perjury. And the recording proved intent to violate my civil rights. That's a federal felony. Rick looked at the cuffs. Turn around, the marshal said. Rick stood up, shaking. He turned around. For the second time in this story, handcuffs clicked. But this time, they were on the wrists of the man who deserved them. Vivian watched him get led away. She didn't smile. She just touched the locket around her neck. It's starting, Darius, she thought. The federal courthouse in downtown Seattle was built to look like a fortress of justice. Granite pillars, marble floors, and air conditioning that kept the temperature at a sterile, chilling constant. On the day of Richard Studer's sentencing, the atmosphere inside courtroom 4B was heavy enough to crush a man's lungs. Rick sat at the defense table, but he was a ghost of the man who had swaggered through the Oakwood Cemetery 6 months ago. The bravado was gone, stripped away by weeks of confinement in the county jail while awaiting this hearing. His suit, once tight across his broad shoulders, now hung loosely on a frame, wasted by stress and untasted prison food. His skin was pasty, his eyes rimmed with red, sleepless circles. He wasn't Sergeant Studer anymore. He was inmate 8940. The gallery was packed. Reporters lined the back row. Sketch artists scribbled furiously. And in the front row, sitting with the poise of a queen, was Justice Vivian Banks. She wore white today, a sharp contrast to the black of the funeral. Beside her sat Charles, his hand firmly gripping hers. They weren't there to gloat. They were there to witness the final rotation of the wheel. Judge Harrison, a federal judge known for his distaste for corruption, shuffled the papers on his bench. The silence in the room was absolute. Mr. Studer, Judge Harrison said, his voice gravelly and devoid of warmth. Before I pass sentence, is there anything you wish to say? Rick stood up. His legs shook so violently the table rattled. He gripped the wood to steady himself. He had practiced a speech, something about regret, about mistakes, about how the stress of the job had gotten to him. But looking at the judge, and then glancing peripherally at Vivian, the words died in his throat. Rick's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. I didn't know who she was. I was just trying to do my job. I never meant to hurt anyone. I have a family, Your Honor. Please. It was the wrong thing to say. Vivian didn't flinch, but Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed behind his spectacles. You didn't know who she was, the judge repeated slowly. That, Mr. Studer, is precisely the problem. You believed she was a nobody. You believed she was powerless. And because of that, you felt entitled to strip her of her civil rights, to assault her dignity, and to desecrate the burial of her son. The judge leaned forward. The measure of a society is not how it treats its Supreme Court justices, but how it treats its most vulnerable citizens. You have proven that you cannot be trusted with authority over either. The gavel didn't bang yet. The tension stretched until it was physically painful. Richard Studer, on the counts of deprivation of rights under colour of law and perjury, this court sentences you to 120 months, 10 years, in a federal correctional institution. There will be no possibility of parole. A gasp went through the room. 10 years. For a cop, that was a death sentence. No, Rick's ex-wife, who had shown up only for the sake of their children, let out a sob from the back. Rick's knees gave out. He collapsed back into his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. 10 years. He would miss his daughter's graduations. He would miss their weddings. He would be an old man when he saw the sky as a free citizen again. Remand to the custody of the U.S. Marshals, the judge ordered. The marshals moved in immediately. There was no professional courtesy this time. They pulled Rick's arms behind his back, the handcuffs ratcheting tight, tighter than necessary perhaps, a silent message from law enforcement officers who despised dirty cops. As they dragged him out, Rick looked frantically at the gallery, locking eyes with Vivian one last time. He was looking for mercy, for forgiveness. He found neither. Vivian simply watched him go, her face a mask of stone. She had given him the law, exactly as he had demanded it. The transport bus to FCI Sheridan smelled of diesel, sweat, and despair. Rick was shackled at the waist and ankles, chained to a bench next to a kid who looked no older than 20, convicted of wire fraud. The realization of his fate hit Rick in waves of nausea. He knew what happened to cops inside. There was a reason he was being sent to a facility with a specialized protective custody unit. In the general population, he wouldn't last 24 hours. But even PC was a prison. When the bus arrived at the prison gates, the grey walls loomed over them, topped with razor wire that glistened in the Oregon rain. The processing was a systematic dehumanization. "Strip," a guard barked. Rick hesitated. He was used to giving that order, not following it. "I said strip, inmate." He stripped. He lifted his arms. He opened his mouth. He was sprayed for lice. He was given a jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too big and smelled of industrial detergent. He was given a cardboard box with a thin blanket, a toothbrush, and a bar of soap that smelled like lye. "Studer," the intake officer said, looking at a clipboard. He was a thick-necked man with a mustache, chewing on a toothpick. He looked at Rick with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You're going to Unit D, the safe wing. Don't get comfortable. It's safe from the general pop, but you're in there with the other rats, snitches, and ex-law enforcement. It ain't a country club." Rick was marched down a long, echoing corridor. The sounds of prison were deafening, shouting, metal clanging on metal, the constant buzz of electric gates. His cell was 89. It was smaller than his bathroom at home. A metal bunk, a metal toilet, a metal sink. The door slid shut with a final, booming clang that vibrated in Rick's teeth. He stood in the center of the cell, clutching his box of belongings. He was alone. He sat on the thin mattress and stared at the graffiti scratched into the wall by the previous occupant. God left this place. For the first time since the funeral, Rick cried. He didn't cry for Vivian. He didn't cry for the injustice he had caused. He cried for himself, a selfish, weeping sound that echoed off the concrete walls. He realized that the power he had cherished, the badge he had hidden behind, was gone. He was nothing, and he had 10 years of nothingness stretching out before him. While Rick Studer was learning the dimensions of his new cage, Vivian Banks sat in the living room of her home in Seattle. The fireplace was lit, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. But Vivian felt cold. On the coffee table sat a check. It was from the city of Seattle. The amount was staggering. $18 million. It lay there like a loaded weapon. Charles walked in, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He set them down and sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. He didn't speak. He knew her well enough to know she was processing. "It feels dirty," Vivian whispered, staring at the check. "It feels like I'm profiting from Darius's funeral." "It's not profit, Viv," Charles said softly. "It's a penalty. It's the city admitting they failed us. They failed him." Vivian picked up the check. Her fingers trembled. 18 million. Do you know how many lives this could change? And yet, I would burn it all in a heartbeat, just to have 5 more minutes with him. Just to finish burying him without... Her voice broke. "I know," Charles soothed, pulling her close. "I know." Vivian took a deep breath. The steel that had carried her through the trial returned to her spine. "I can't keep this, Charles. We have enough. If I keep this money, every time I look at a new car or a vacation, I'll see Rick Studer's face. I'll see the mud on my coat. I won't let that man have any part of my future." "So, what do we do?" Charles asked. Vivian looked at the mantel, where a framed photo of Darius sat. He was wearing his hard hat, holding a roll of blueprints, smiling that wide, infectious smile that could light up a room. He had wanted to design low-income housing. He had wanted to fix the broken parts of the city through architecture. "We build," Vivian said, a sudden clarity washing over her. "Rick Studer tried to destroy. So we are going to build." She stood up, the check clutched in her hand. "Call the dean at the university. Tell him we need to schedule a meeting. We're going to create something that will outlast Studer's prison sentence. Something that will outlast us." 3 months later, the main atrium of the University of Washington's College of Architecture was transformed. Banners hung from the ceiling, deep purple and gold. A podium stood on a raised stage, flanked by the mayor, a new one after the previous one resigned in the wake of the scandal, and the university president. But the crowd was looking at Vivian. She stood at the microphone, looking out at a sea of young faces, students of every race, every background, clutching sketchbooks and coffees, their eyes wide with anticipation. "When I lost my son," Vivian began, her voice amplified through the hall, "I thought the story had ended. I thought his dreams of reshaping this city had gone into the ground with him." The room was silent. "But I learned something in the fires of the last year," she continued. "I learned that justice is not just about punishing the guilty. That is the easy part. True justice is about restoration. It is about taking the broken pieces of a tragedy and forging them into a foundation." She motioned to Charles, who stood by a large curtained wall behind her. "The man who arrested me," Vivian said, her voice hardening slightly, "did so because he saw a stereotype, not a person. He saw a threat, not a promise. He cost the city $18 million because of his blindness." She paused, smiling for the first time in a long time. "So, I decided to use that money to open some eyes." Charles pulled the cord. The velvet curtains fell away to reveal a stunning architectural rendering of a new glass and steel wing of the university, and a bronze plaque embedded in the wall. "The Darius Banks Institute for Urban Equity, full tuition scholarships for minority architects. Building a foundation for justice. Effective immediately," Vivian announced. "This $18 million endowment will ensure that 50 students every year, students who have the talent but not the means, will receive a full ride to this university. No student here will ever be judged by their wallet, their car, or their skin color. You will be judged only by the height of your imagination. The applause that erupted was not polite. It was raucous. It was thunderous. Students were cheering, throwing hats in the air. The dean was wiping his eyes. Vivian watched them. She watched a young black girl in the front row, clutching her acceptance letter, tears streaming down her face. Vivian looked at the girl and nodded. "It's for you," Vivian thought. "It's all for you." The final scene of the drama did not happen in a courtroom or a university hall. It happened back where it all began, Oakwood Memorial Park. It was late afternoon. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the grass. The storm that had raged on the day of the funeral was a distant memory. The air was sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine. Vivian walked alone up the gentle slope. She wasn't wearing the black morning coat anymore. She wore a simple beige trench coat, unbuttoned, catching the breeze. She reached the grave. The earth had settled. The grass was a vibrant, healthy green, knitting together the scar in the ground. The headstone was polished granite, gleaming in the twilight. Darius Banks' beloved son, dreamer, builder. Vivian knelt on the grass. She didn't mind the stains this time. She ran her hand over the cold stone, warming it with her touch. "Hi, baby," she whispered. She pulled a folded newspaper from her pocket. The headline read, "Former Sergeant Studer denied appeal." She placed the paper on the ground, then struck a match. She lit the corner of the paper. She watched as the flame curled the edges, turning the news of Rick's fate into grey ash. She watched it burn until there was nothing left but dust, which the wind gently carried away. "It's finished," she said to the grave. "He can't hurt us anymore, and he can't hurt anyone else." She sat there for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon. She thought about the 10 years Rick would spend in a box. She thought about the 50 students starting class next week in Darius's name. Karma hadn't just hit back, it had reshaped the world. Vivian stood up. She brushed her knees off. She felt lighter, as if a heavy wet coat had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She turned and walked back toward her car. She didn't look back. There was no need to. Darius wasn't in the ground anymore. He was in the skyline of the city. He was in the sketches of the students. He was everywhere. As she drove out of the cemetery gates, the radio played a soft jazz tune. Vivian rolled down the window, letting the cool evening air rush in. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the smell of rain and pine. For the first time in a year, the air tasted sweet. It tasted like victory. And that brings us to the end of the saga of Justice Vivian Banks. It's a story that started with the worst kind of prejudice, but ended with a legacy that will last for generations. Rick Studer thought he was the law, but he found out the hard way that true power isn't about a badge or a gun. It's about integrity. He's sitting in a cell right now, while the money the city paid for his arrogance is building the next generation of architects. It really makes you think about how one decision, one moment of ego, can dismantle an entire life. I want to hear from you guys in the comments. Do you think the $18 million settlement was enough? And if you were Vivian, would you have donated all of it? Or would you have kept some for yourself after everything you went through? It's a tough choice. Let's talk about it down below. If this story moved you, or if you just love seeing justice served ice cold, please destroy that like button. It helps the algorithm find more people who need to hear these stories. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I have a really intense story coming up next week, about a CEO who fires his own wife by mistake. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, and remember, be careful who you judge. I'll see you in the next one.